I think it's better for me to stand so I can look at everyone's faces. I would just first like to, and this will sort itself out, first like to thank all of you for coming. This is such a blessing, and it's such an honor and a privilege to come back and do this. There is a group of fellows, a lot of them because of travel had to do it online, on Zoom, but I wanted to make sure I am home and show you what I've used, right? So I used Chicago collections. I looked at Chicago lives, and I wanted to be in Chicago to tell their story, okay? And so, oh, you're welcome. and so we're going to get started with the presentation. Of course, we have slides, and I wanted to make it visual so you could see about these folks. This picture here, it haunts me. I could have it on my desktop and just stare at it and look at the faces. It is from Dewey Jones' collection, which is at Vivian Harsh Library. And Dewey Jones was a Chicago Defender reporter, and he's back here in the corner there. Right, and one of my colleagues, and she'll laugh when she watches this, she said, this throng of black elites, right? It's just so many of them. Yeah. And just to picture, it is, and it'll sort itself out, of that particular time, all right? And so it gives us a snapshot into leisure life. I said, when I looked at it, I said, they look satisfied, right, and content. And this is an early 20th century representation. And there are some familiar faces in here, but I'll get back to that later because I have surprises for a lot of people about things that I found with this. And what we're going to look at is not necessarily all of these young people, but a collection of young people who created these books. And when I say these books, I mean they called them wonder books, like yearbooks. They functioned as directories, as informationals, as, I would say, literature, art. So it encompassed everything. And what the goal was there was to show the progress, achievements of Black Chicago at that time. And that time was in the 1920s, around the time of the Harlem Renaissance that we hear about. But that was a phenomenon that was nationwide. It just didn't happen in New York, right? And so what we had here in Chicago that Harlem didn't have was this kind of business sense where we were established in a community that had political weight, right, and religious weight. Right, not saying it didn't happen anywhere else, but the way it was represented here was unique. And the group of students that put together these books saw it as an opportunity for them to show off also their knowledge, right, and to show their cultural pride. So they were Black and proud. They didn't call themselves Black and proud, but they called themselves these new Negroes. They knew who they were. All right, and we're talking about maybe the grandchildren of those that were enslaved. So this is going on first and second generation of Black folks to go to higher education. And I'm going to go ahead and, okay, a treasure forever. Okay, so I'll leave. Okay, all right. This right here is a letter that was sent out to the Crisis magazine of the NAACP. And it's the young people who created the book wanting and requesting that the Crisis review the book in their next issue. All right, and it was this is so valuable. I didn't find this in the archives, I found it online, but it represents how they tell their own story about what they did, right? And they said that it's the largest and most elaborate book ever published about the people of the great city of Chicago. Right? They were very enthusiastic. They were very proud of who they were. And they didn't hesitate to tell anybody, right, that this was the biggest, this was the best. They used that kind of inflated language to express who they were in Chicago. And they said here, and I'm just going to read a section of it, they said, we would suggest a feature story on the book in your magazine, meaning The Crisis. Books may be secured at YMCA, which is still there, 3763 Wabash Avenue, at $2.50. Paper covers and $4 for leather. Okay, copies are sent COD. Oh my God, what is that? Cash on delivery. Cash on delivery if checks do not accompany orders. All right, and it's the Negro in Chicago, and they said it will be an invaluable as a reference book. This is something we use in library language when we talk about encyclopedias and things of that nature. They saw themselves creating their own encyclopedia as it deals with the large progressive Negro community, right? And this was actually found in the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois online, right? And they're continually working on that. It wasn't there before, and as they work on bringing those things online. And up top here, it has the staff, right? And so we can see all of these are young people who were attending college, law school, graduate school in the city of Chicago, all right? And there was something that allowed something about the higher education institutions in the city that made something like this possible. Because of the fact, and I don't have the exact dates for all of this, that Black students were able to attend these schools, right? We had our own schools like Crane College, which became Malcolm X College, but they attended the University of Chicago, Northwestern Law School, medical school, here in the city and downstate in Illinois, right? And so that way we had like a large segment of the young people that could come here and do that. And the word was out. And right here we have the president and editor of the books. His name was Frederick Robb. And this tells a little bit about a review of the book, but I thought about, I don't know, who's familiar with that movie, Cotton Comes to Harlem? All right, so this whole endeavor is with Rob coming to Chicago. All right, Rob was from Connecticut, brilliant, and he went to Howard University and created some kind of yearbook in 1925. Right? And he brought that same type of acumen here to the city amongst these students. And he worked with student groups, not only at the university, but across the country. So he was one of the few Black people to work with students. And at the time, he was a law school student at Northwestern University. And this is from the Pittsburgh Courier. This is a brief from the review of the book. It contains 233 pages. Sorry about the in and out. It may be obtained in either paper or leather binding. It is a combination college annual, history, and general reference, and who's who of the Windy City. The book contains more data concerning the varied classes. So it didn't just sit on top. You know, we saw those beautiful young things, right? But it didn't just sit on top, right? They talked about every one of Negro activities in the great Midwestern city than any such compilation thus far chronicled. And this is from the Pittsburgh Courier. There was a lot of, at the time that it was published, the reviews had some choice words to say about the organization of it. There's a lot of typos, there's a lot of mistakes. Some things pick up on one page and go to the next. And they're often little tidbits of information that are kind of intermingled. On one page you can find lynching stats, but then they can have whatever the sororities on the same page. So, you know, they put it, these are students that are doing it. And when they did get into the crisis, it said this, and it was the December issue. You know, I look at that photo, I'll never see crisis in that photo, but, you know, we can think about that later for a Black magazine, right? But it represents an astonishing amount of work and must have meant the expenditure of much money. Okay, so we'll talk about the resources. It is arranged in a rather bewildering way. Oh, come on, technology, which makes it difficult to use as a reference book, but as a picture of colored Chicago, it is about the best single volume. Okay, and so it was unique in that way. And here on this slide, I have the covers of the different editions and productions of the book in 1927 and 1929. The thing is they went out, what they said in the Defender, pad and pen in hand, collecting data about the Negro in the city. All right, and it was an outgrowth of their work with the Urban League. Right, they weren't workers there, but they had access to it. And they supported them in this data across the city. And these are the covers of the book. This is a 1927 leather cover, and this is a cloth cover of the 1927 book. On the end here are the 1929 editions. When they published the 1927 book, they said that there's more to come because they knew they had so much more to give. All right, and this is purely an intellectual exercise to demonstrate the power of Black Chicago at that time. And another thing, and I'll get to this as well, if we look at the iconography that they use, we see a lot of Egyptian references. A lot of Egyptian references. Here, this beetle, here on the chariot, but it's hard to make out here. There's an Egyptian figure, a female figure, and the male figure has on a cap and a gown. So what was important? Education, right? Okay, so let's move on here. Okay, and so this is that 1927 book, and just a quick little ditty about how I obtained this. During the pandemic, there was a stage sale, and I told my mother to get down there. I was in New York. I said, Mom, you got to go, because I wanted some art. It was, what's her name? Etta Moten. Yeah. She had an estate sale during the pandemic, and I wanted some Margaret Burroughs art, right? And I gave her a budget of, say, like $500. Then I called back. I said, no, 200. And then she said, well, I'm in line outside. They don't let a few people in. I said, no, 100. Let's see what we can do, right? And she's walking around on the phone, and she said, there's a book, The Negro in Chicago. I said, buy it. Right? And so this is a copy of that particular edition. And
6:21 p.m. 6:21 p.m.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right. And so it was with this and others, it was like $50 package, but when you try to find, it's worth about $700 to $1,000. Right, because it's that rare. Okay. All right. Okay, and this shows the different, and you can see, like, I'm going to go back, the differences in the progress to how they created the book, because it just gives like a survey here. It says it's given a survey of the city of who's who in Chicago. Notice the dates that they use, 1779 to 1927. Why 1779? You don't have to answer the question, but if someone knows the answer.
That's where Chicago was.
Okay, Dr. White, thank you. That's when Chicago was. Right, but they wanted to point towards DuSable. Okay, so they're in a black city founded by a black man with this newfound black pride.
Okay.
All right, and so, when I hear my students talk about Black Lives Matter, I'm like, oh, that went on 100 years ago and more, right? Okay, and and then they said, the directory, facts, and figures about the Negro for what? 8,000 years. So what type of historical perspective is that? It doesn't start with, no shade, 1619. Right, so they went back to early civilizations, right, in Egypt. So there was that kind of sensibility. And when they did like the second volume, and this is like a combination volume, what they did in 1929, it shows that they really wanted to focus on this kind of achievement and excellence, right? And they also wanted to use it as a communication tool, where they had these articles written up about different issues surrounding labor, education. There was something called The Last Hired, First Fired. They had another article on women and the professions, right? And they talked about politics. I didn't expect to see that. I expected to see social work, teaching, librarianship, and things like that. But they talked about politics, all of the areas where black women were working. So it's very much so enhanced. And, it didn't just come out of nowhere, because we are talking about kids who have been around. And so just one other note, a lot of the students came from outside of the city to come here to study. But there were a lot of them also, maybe I would say 60-40, that were from the city and those that came in to study, right? And so they had access to other type of publications that could inspire this. All right, and this is called the Souvenir of Negro Progress, and this was published in 1925, and it has a lot of the same elements in it. So it's like, okay, so they compiled information instead of wrote about it, right? I also found through my research that they use images and publications from the Urban League. Phillips High School yearbook also was very inspirational to this, okay? And also the Blue Book. And that was like a business directory. So they borrowed from all of those things. But they mention all of the things that they use, so it's not like they're stealing necessarily. Okay, all right, and just a note about the aesthetics. All right, this is from inside the book, okay? And as I stated before, they use Egypt as a point of reference for Black history. Not necessarily the South, not, you know, other things. They didn't mind going back to Africa. And there's also photographs of West African objects there as well. So this was an intellectual exercise in connecting with Egypt, ancient Egypt, not West Africa, but ancient Egypt. There is a history written in the book that goes back to 8,000 years, and that was written by a graduate student, one of the students involved, who was at the University of Chicago. His name was John Tilley, right? And the reason why I mention him is because, you know, part of the research, and I'll get to that as well, is that not only did I look at the books and the people, I looked at where they went, right? Where did they go forward in their lives, right? Because this is a snapshot of people who are between the ages of like 18 and 24 as such. And so he wrote that history back 8,000 years. And what's significant about John Tilley, and there's a lot of significance in dealing with a lot of these young people, is that he was the first director of the Southern Christian Leadership Council.
Oh my goodness.
Right? And so there are other names in there as well, right? Okay, so enter the bright young thing. So who are these young people? All right, and this particular picture here is from the second edition, where they kind of lined up the photographs here vertically. And this inspiration was from Phillips High School yearbook at the time. And I was able to look at those during my research. And a young man sitting here in the middle, his name was Arthur Logan, right? And I had an opportunity to look in his papers. And he was a graphic designer. He also sang, and he was a member of Monumental Baptist Church, right? And so, but he brought the kind of aesthetic from Wendell Phillips to these books, right? Because he was too young the first go round, but he helped with the second go round. Okay, so this is just some information about the club they belong to. It was established in 1909 and it ran to 1915 and was dormant. I don't want to go through all of the order, but just to tell a story, it was established by social workers, white social workers. I was talking to Dr. Reed, Christopher, and he told me that, you know, as much as he wanted this to be about Black people, there were some white women that helped start to begin this group for these students because they wanted something for these Black students who were going to college in the city. Right. Yeah, social workers with the heart. And it was out of Frederick Douglass Center, which was a center on the South Side. A lot of intellectual work going on there. And then it was dormant for some times. And then they, you know, kind of met so often, but they became more year-round in 1922. And I can imagine, I don't know all of the reasons around that, but I believe it has something to do with the emergence of more students coming to the city, right? And, you know, increased student body at the medical schools and dental schools and as such. And in 1926 is when they became incorporated, I believe, either 1926 or 1927 with the state of Illinois. And they had a constitution, they had a strategic plan, and, you know, keep this in mind too. back in 1909, I should know this. The fraternities and sororities were just getting established at that time too, right? And so, yeah, 1906 and 08, I should know. Don't tell nobody, LaJohn. and so by the time we come into 1920s, we have like these white from all of them are present, right? And they all are represented in the city. Right, and so we have a group of young folks who are belonging to these kind of clubs as well, and fraternities and sororities. And this is their language. It's the largest student organization in America, 217 students, and 197 visiting students, 43 nationalities, 3 continents. You know, they had people from West African students that were participating. So I know about that. I don't know what other continents they were talking about. And 39 states and 117 high schools and colleges that were represented. Okay, and this is just another example of a picture from the 1929 book, and we can see Frederick Robb here. And what they saw this club was, and as I stated before, is the need to bring together the few colored students attending the college and universities in Chicago in the summer and living in various parts of the city. So it tried to alleviate this kind of isolation. Because if you're a black student studying at the University of Chicago, what would that feel like? Right? And if you were at Northwestern in the law school, what would that feel like? Might be different for those young people who are going to Crane College, but there was still, you know, a different type of environment. And so this is a representative of the officers of the, and we notice, and I think it's on another slide, if not, I'll say it here. I think it was more women than men, right? So that's significant to note, even then. Okay, and so this is kind of cool. This is also shows their activities, right? And this is what they put in the book for that year, from 1926 to 1927. A lot of their activities surrounded either debate and leisure. So they would have these kind of debates, some about, what was it, birth control. And I said, man, as long as I've been teaching in higher ed, that's the one paper every student wants to write. It's about birth control. And so it's very interesting to see that they were talking about that then. So it kind of gives you a snapshot. And one of the, I can't picture it out now, but one of the debates was with Ida B. Wells, right, about the Negro, something about leadership in the race. Right, and and they also had like programs. This is a whole Founders Day program they had, and all the folks that participated in that. And they also had picnics and dances and such. But it was interesting to see what the whole kind of schedule was. Another significant member, and he's mentioned here, and they also traveled and did these kind of debates because they went to Indianapolis. And I don't know if you're familiar with Horace Bond or Horace Mann Bond. He was the father of Julian Bond. He earned his PhD at the University of Chicago and was a part of the student group. Yeah, and so he was very active. And so this is I'm sorry about it going in and out, but this is other photographs of them. This is also from the 1929 book. And it shows, they say it's a club with an intensive program. And it shows them working in the office there at the Wabash Y, and also different pictures. And, you know, she won a contest for raising funds. And, you know, this is how they represented themselves. And there's also a picture in here, I can't point it out. There's international students they invited to come to Chicago. And they also attended student conferences. Okay, and so the design team, and I'm going back to Arthur Logan there, and there are other artists as well. Not going to go into all of their autobiographies, but Charles Dawson was the one responsible for the cover and a lot of the drawings around Egypt, right? And some of the others did the layouts, and also some of these artists were featured in the Chicago Defender and other Black newspapers, right? And so they had careers beyond this, even though he was considered maybe mature for the time, but they all worked together, right? And that artistic vision was supported here just as it was supported in New York at the time, I found, also with the research. Okay, that's a sign for me to, okay, so these are some of the collections. I'm gonna give, just a quick overview of the collections I use. I love this photo. It was from Arthur Logan's collection. He had so many pictures of contemporaries, right? Because he grew up here, born here. You have his elementary school picture, he and his sister, his family, his friends from Phillips, all the clubs he had there as well. And so this was in his collection. I think he didn't have a name on it. I forgot what the thing said. I think it said something about she's sad and lonely or something. She looked like she mad. Okay, so. All right, so these are some of the collections I use. I use University of Illinois and Vivian Harsh collections. University of Illinois had the Wabash YMCA collections where they met, and also Chicago Public Library Vivian Harsh collection where Arthur Logan and Dewey Jones had their collections. University of Chicago, there I looked at some of the student groups because many of them worked as students. So for example, John Tilley, the one who became the first president of SCLC, he resigned, by the way, right? He didn't last long. I don't know why. So you have to look that up, that's your own trivia. But he was part of something they called, interracial club, right? And so that kind of student groups, right? And I looked to see how they, gave them, resources. At the University of Chicago, like I said, it was the student groups. And the Newberry Library looked at some of the older publications out of the Black community here, especially like the souvenir book. And actually I found the book itself, the books at Newberry, at University of Illinois, and at the University of Chicago, and at the Chicago Public Library. So they actually have copies of the books there. At Harsh, they only have a photocopy, but it's easier to use. All right, so this is a surprise for some people here. All right, and so this is hard to see it, but there's an acknowledgement given in the 1929 book, right? It says the Chicago Whip, and they're giving acknowledgement, they're naming newspapers, the Defender, the public libraries, the DuSable, they call it DuSable, like the DuSable Association, and Chicago World's Fair Commission, 1933, it's going to come back up, Chicago Historical Society, etc. And one of the most important institutions is Cary AME Social Service Center, directed by Reverend Frederick D. Jordan. All right, and the reason why I do this because it's members, and that's my family's church, right? And the funny part is this is the month of our anniversary, and our anniversary is tied with these books and these young people, right? The pastor that was founding pastor went to Howard University with the young man Rob, who started these yearbooks. Right, and they worked out of the Y for a while, and I guess they got grown and more specific on how they wanted to conduct their business. So they kind of broke away from the Y and became more independent, and where they landed was Cary Temple AME Church, right? And so, and it's, wanted to also show the members that are here too that it was considered a social service center. Right? Church and Social Service Center. 1929 aligned with the books. All right, it's other things featured in here too. And I think I might get back to that. It might be out of order, but that's okay. This, and I forgot to mention, I went to the archives of Crane College as well, right? And that's located at Roosevelt University. And here we have a record, just so some of the things that I found, of one of the students that was involved with the Intercollegiate Club. All right, and in his picture in the book, it says he's doing all these wonderful things. But then, when I went to do my research on him, it said he was dismissed under the rules in 1926. But in the 1927 book, handsome guy, just laughing, suited up, but, he had some issues there in college. I got my schools mixed up. It's the Y school, the YMCA college was affiliated with Roosevelt University, or became Roosevelt University. But this is his record here. So this was fun to look at. Also, and this is another surprise for some of the people here who might have attended Dunbar Vocational High School, their guidance counselor was a member of the club as well. I don't know if you remember. Look at him. It said, Mr. Arthur Turnbull.
I remember. So that's a young Turnbull. Yes. You were there when we were there?
Okay.
He was an old guy, too.
Yeah, oh, was he? Okay. All right, so trivia, well, not really, well, trivia about him. He was good friends with Faith Jefferson, who married Dewey Jones. Right? And Dewey Jones is the one I mentioned, the collections I was in, and he was the reporter for the Chicago Defender. And they attended Crane together. And I believe they came up together because there's notes in the collections from those two. So he was involved with the youth, the Intercollegiate Club as well. So he attended Crane, and then he graduated, went to University of Chicago, majored in business. And I don't have it here, but I did read his obituary in the Times where his son said that he couldn't get a job in his field, right? And so that's one of the reasons why he went to work for the board at Dunbar High School. Yeah, another, some behind the scenes, he married. His first wife was one of the young ladies that was involved. And she worked at the Chicago Defender as well. And they divorced within a year or two. And when she announced her divorce, she announced who she was marrying next. And she worked at she lived at Rosenwald, so I thought that was it. Her name was Consuelo Young. She's very important to the Chicago Public Library system as well, but that's a whole nother story. This was also something I found in the archives last summer, and it was one thing where I can connect a young person in reference to the Intercollegiate Club. And she, Dewey Jones, he had a lot of women in his collections. And what I mean by that is like a lot of just like any young man, a lot of photographs of young women, a lot of notes from young women. He had like this little address book, signed book with a lot of young women sign their names in it. And if we notice it this way, she puts 11:44 p.m. So this definitely isn't at night. Right, so this is Sunday, January 31st, and she says, spent a delightful, evening at the Intercollegiate meeting. Okay, and she goes on to talk about, something else. Then she says, suffer later. She pauses, says, suffer later. And then, and then she went on to say something else. But yeah, I thought her name is Elton. Couldn't find her last name or where this is located. It was obviously in front of someone's house. But it was the first time I could see a young person refer to this, right, as something that they did, as an activity. Okay, and this is Arthur Logan again. And what I wanted to show you, this is something else I found at the archives. And this is a picture of like the student government there at Phillips High School, right? And that was very important because he being from Phillips, and in his collection, he had every Phillips yearbook from 1924, I think, to 1929. Right, and it's rare to see a grouping of those yearbooks like that, right? And it was a significant part of the development of the books. And I think this is my last slide, and then we'll go on to conversation and questions. When I mention the significance of this person, you see his name is P-Day Hammurabi, right? Okay, his name before that was Frederick Robb. All right, think about this black man, 1930s, you know.
Changed his name.
Yeah, changed his name, went to Africa, you know, saw the light.
Okay.
Right, so this was happening in the 1930s. And he did finish at Northwestern, and he thought that he would go to London and study and, you know, have a practice. He did go to London and study and came back and brought these African students with him to work with the students. But he became someone who, I would say, he was like a bookseller, right? He promoted Black history in the city. He died in 1978. Maybe some of us that are more mature might remember him. He sold books out of hair salons. He used to have these programs over within the city as well. And you know, some kind of tidbit that Arthur Logan, he was very close to him and wrote his obituary. He said that he never used the word like 50 or 500. He would say half of 100. So he had these little quirks, and he said he was always shabbily dressed, you know, as he got older. And, you know, he died because he went to another trip, because he used to take these trips to Africa, right? And he took a trip to the Caribbean, and he got sick and couldn't get over that. But, you know, he's extremely significant to this. And, you know, I don't like that term unsung so much, because all we have to do is read to, you know, hear someone's song, right? But he is truly an unsung hero of the Black history movement itself, right? And so I believe, right, this is it. So this is the last collective pursuit. And this is within the book, and it shows a typical group of students from the club. And this is them meeting and being together, right? So thank you so very much. That is all I have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gray.
Wonderful. Once again, Dr. Gray, that was an amazing presentation. I loved it. I wish we could talk more about divorces and sneaking out new husbands and all that.
Well, they live lives, all right.
That's what we want to hear. We want to hear the juice.
Yeah.
But I've been taking notes and go over a few things. If I can read my chicken scratch or just give it to me by osmosis. Yes. Yeah, you don't want to see the back of my head. Even though I did get a haircut. So, the first thing that I picked up on was to talk about the new Negro and, you know, Alain Locke and part of the Harlem Renaissance. Like they're no longer, these are the generation after enslavement, post-emancipation. So, I want you to kind of talk about that, what they were going through, and kind of maybe compare it to what I was hearing during the early stages of the Black Lives Matter movement was of the Black excellence and celebrating that, and kind of how's that, maybe that's I don't know, maybe, I always tell this to my students, what you do is not new, it's a remix. So talk about the remix and the original.
Okay, so I'm going to use someone else's words. It's Arne von Tops. He was a writer and poet during the Harlem Renaissance. He was actually located in two places, in New York and then came to Chicago, right? He called that period an awakening. Someone asked, his papers are at Syracuse, and someone asked him to write about the Harlem Renaissance. And on the title of it, he put The Awakening, right? But when they published it, they put the Harlem Renaissance, right? And so I believe, you know, just like all groups of people, we go through these cycles of awakening, right? So it might look different than what it did in the 60s, right? And then in the 90s. And then most recently, right? And we could all, you know, we could argue about the dates, but that's the ones I have in my head. And for them, it was, like I said, it was nationwide. It wasn't really specific to New York City. But from what I can glean, based on what, you know, there's works like DeVarian Baldwin, the scholar, he wrote a whole book on Chicago New Negroes, is this kind of consciousness about what it means to be Black, right? And there's also independence of thought, right? And so it's not like they're asking for anything, they're creating it themselves. They're also embracing art in a new way. The class, this kind of educated class kind of exploded. And it wasn't at the cost of those who weren't, because they had a perspective. They wanted to move the race forward. A lot of the young people became school teachers, right? Worked in libraries. Many of them did work for the Board of Education, to tell the truth. Became ministers, right? Professors, journalists, right? And in their mind, they wanted to work with young people. So it's kind of like this conscious, not for themselves, but to, you know, uplift the race, to go from another awakening period in the 1890s, right? And so I believe that's how they are situated. And Horace Bond, he wrote, he made a speech, and he wrote about it in a book, about what is a new Negro, right? And he talked about that in terms of education, and about, you know, some of it was kind of what we call today respectability politics, because they wanted you to be refined in a way where you don't care what people say about you, right? You don't cry when the white folks say whatever, because you know who you are, right? It was that type of language. So, you know, and as we, to me too, is the aesthetic in how they dress and how they present themselves. It might not be with dreads and with African prints and hair wrap, but there's something about their styling that goes along with that as well.
Another thing that I picked up on when you showed the Wonder Books is the Egyptian iconography, and there's a connection to Africa. So can you just talk about that, kind of like the agency they had? Because at this time in the 1920s, this is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This is after they showed Birth of a Nation in the White House. And this is around the time where they're saying that Africa has no history. But these are young people are having the agency to say, no, this is where we come from, not what you're telling us where we come from.
Exactly, and I think that's tied up to the movement of the times. Okay, one thing I did look at this summer, and it wasn't here, it was in New York City. I went to the Met. They had the Harlem Renaissance exhibit. And I sent a text to somebody, and I said that, you know, like I've died and gone to heaven, right? And when I landed up there with all of this artwork, there was clearly understanding and reverence for where we come from and our ancestry, if I could put it like that. You can see it visualized even within the Crisis magazine around that time. The covers, some of those are similar to the covers of the Crisis magazine. Also, one of the, Faith Jefferson was an AKA, right? And so I was looking in her collections along with their husbands, and she even had the Ivy Leaf, which was the magazine for Alpha Kappa Alpha. Even at that time in 1925, they would have like this African motif on the cover of the Ivy Leaf. So we're talking about this kind of movement and understanding what that connection represented, right? And it really shows up in Hammurabi, which was Felipe or whatever, his Frederick, what he used to be, in his life's mission. And in the book he writes, we don't know about our own history. Where have we heard that before? Oh my God. All you got to do is go on YouTube, right? Or Facebook. So we don't know enough about our own history, right? And so, you know, a part of his mission with this was to promote that. And what I want to get across too is that these things are connected, right? So we know Rob was at Howard, and Dr. Locke was at Howard. Maybe I'm getting that. Well, yeah, and Dr. Locke was at Howard, and these types of things were brewing up even at that time in the early 20s because of that class of Black intellectuals who were teaching those things as well. And so it's connected to things that went on in DC, here in Chicago, and even bringing Jordan here, who established something like at our church at Carey Temple. And so all of these things are connected. right? And so, part of this work is to show, not just in isolation, but how all of this stuff is going on at the same time. We're used to living that way because we have access to internets and news and things. We can see Black Lives Matter protests in every city, right? It wasn't just so simple there. They had their technology through the newspapers and such, but it was like this kind of universal type movement that was going on that sprung out of there, like Marcus Garvey. All of these things were happening at the same time. It was so rich. Yeah.
So this is a question just about going into the archives. When you went into the archives, what is something that you found and said, I did not expect to see this and I am blown away?
Oh my God. I would say two things. One was that photo on the cover, because I couldn't stop looking at it. Right. Another thing was the handwritten obituary of Rob and what actually was published. He published in a Crusade newspaper. If you know what that is, right? It's a Black news. It's on the South Side, right? And he published it there. But to read his actual notes of what that was and the way he described their effort as young people, because he goes into detail and everything that he left out. It was also cool to see that he was from Monumental. I used to visit there when I was as an usher. So yeah, that those type of things surprised me. I didn't know that about him. Another thing was how Rob came to take over. He sat on the board at the Y with Robert Abbott and all these people. He kind of, he's at the meeting, they're asking him for a report on the books because they knew the young people were working on these books. And there's a picture of the board for the Y and Rob is up there. And then he just did that after the book was published. He was gone. He was off the board. So a part of him was a very much so an opportunist, and he liked to have a seat at the table. That was another thing that kind of surprised me, that how he was into everything. He also did those, how the public schools had those playgrounds. He was a playground supervisor. I didn't know that about him. The only scandal I had was with their counselor, their guidance counselor. I didn't find any other scandals though. Yeah.
I have a question just about the youth of these students. These are very young people, but they took on, it's a monumental task to do that amount of history of Black Chicago. And can you just talk about, just how they were able to be so young, but able to kind of, seize the moment? Because contemporarily now, a lot of young people are facing something that's unprecedented, American fascism. So how were they able to face up and do something monumental? And how can young people now kind of seize the time?
I think that's a good question. I think what helped them was that the fact that they gathered together. And I could stop there, but the fact that they could meet, right? That they could gather together. It was structured, right? And they had definite leadership, some dynamic young people who can make more things happen. And they were connected to things like Rob. He was an alpha. And so the alphas were very, present there. If you notice in that stationery was black and gold. That was not by accident, right? He did that. And so because they could come together and then they could talk about things and they could plan and let's do this, right? And in that activities, they even know the date that they figured that they wanted to do something like this. It would say February, and it was published in October. Right, and so they went to the Chicago Public Library. They know all the places they use: Chicago Public Library, Chicago Historical Society. They use Ida B. Wells Library. They used all types of materials, Urban League, and they pulled those things together and created some things as well. But it was them representing how they saw the world. I think, and I've said this before in another presentation, they were what we would call today content creators, right? And they were using the technology they had available to them at the time. If we see a young lady with a camera putting on a wig, maybe we digress a little bit for creating history articles, but that's what they were doing. They were creating this content. And they were out front, so they had pictures of themselves there, right? Because they wanted to represent. And also to tell about where they came from. You know, some from Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi. They went to all Black colleges all over the country and to come here to study for graduate school. So, you know, Kentucky, all of these places were represented.
So this is my final question before I open it up to the crowd. This is a very Chicago-centric question because it's Black Chicago. And we spoke about this at Sala over lunch. Can you talk about kind of like what the high school is? Because Chicago is one of the few places in the country, I've been all over the country, that where you went to high school is very important. There's Baltimore, Memphis, but
So
Chicago.
true. So true. Well, with them, I don't know if there was enough variety of types of high schools that they attended, but say like Mr. Turnbull, he went to Hyde Park, and there was a cluster of Black students that went to Hyde Park. One that I'm researching now is one of the first Black women to graduate from Syracuse to get in the library, to get a library degree. She was there at Hyde Park with him. Others were there. Consuelo, his first wife, was there at Hyde Park. But Phillips, I think, was the center of the world. There were others, but I think those two mostly, but really Phillips, yeah.
All right, so now,
Because of location, you know, because if we were in Bronzeville, they would go to high school in Bronzeville. Those that might have ventured out to Hyde Park or some other places who had connections would send their children to Hyde Park, yeah, for sure, yeah.
now I'd like to open it up to people. Who
Thanks
ask
for an
questions.
excellent presentation. And in looking at their activities and all that they did, one of the things that I've always thought of, you said they had political, they did socialization, and they were, you know, outgoing. I happen to believe that if we can gather, we should have more of a focus on more than just socialization, but what can we do? And oftentimes now we get social, but we don't do anything to
action.
Exactly. And I happen to believe that, you know, that's one of the things that we should do. The other thing is that I'm looking at when you talk about the open wall with Mr. Turnbull. I didn't know for years, because by the time I was coming along, open wall wasn't, but it was my understanding that it was Rosenwald. It was an elite group or a class, you know, kind of a group that lived there. It wasn't. I didn't know. I didn't always know that. I didn't have a clue of that, but they said a lot of the teachers lived there.
Yeah. He lived there with his wife and her mother, and they were. Was she teaching? She worked at Cleveland Hall Branch Library, so she was on their first staff. His wife, and she went on to get a master's degree in journalism at Northwestern. And she became a professor at State University of Missouri, Lincoln University of Missouri, and she also served in the State Department in India, right, and ran a library over there. She married a second time, and I can say this because she didn't have any children. Her second husband passed, so they divorced, and he passed for white, and she died in Missouri. But she was a very interesting woman, who very much so a career woman. That was another thing I found. A lot of these career-driven women who were, coming out of this, right? It wasn't those kind of myths that we create about these women that are mothers and didn't do careers, and majority of them became career women, even if they married well. Married another professional, or the one woman that was sitting on the in the picture. I might have missed it, but it's before this. I'm going to that. Her, Vivian Garth. Okay, so she was. I found she was interested. She's from Knoxville, Tennessee. And that's where I got my PhD, and I also worked at the University of Tennessee. And she came up here to go to school. And after she finished with this endeavor, and she was like the on the board, executive board. And she wrote the history for the 1929 book. She said the history of the Intercollegiate Club is romance. That's her language. Like, where's this going, girl? but you know, it was beautiful the way she wrote it. But she went on to go to a labor college. So that was another thing that was important to them, was issues around labor and black labor. And they had this small labor college in New York State that she attended. But then she married this guy who she met in Chicago that was a dentist, and they moved to Baltimore. And she worked at the Y. You know, the YWCA there in Baltimore. But, you know, the opportunity to gather and to work towards betterment, you know, that's just, it's not new. I don't like to just be that simple about it. I think it's ongoing in a different fashion through different cycles each time. If we even think about mutual aid societies, you know, at emancipation time, you know, the way people gather. There's this book called Emancipation Circuit by, her name is Thulani Davis, out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. And at the beginning of one of her chapters, she says that, it quotes like a missionary, and they say these Negroes like to come together, you know, and organize, right? And that's somebody on the outside looking at people who were recently enslaved. And so we didn't lose that. And what makes Chicago very interesting is the proliferation of clubs that we had, right? And so that gathering, I think it was something that happened here, just like the high school thing, but it was something that happened here especially.
What about them feeling a sense of responsibility since their parents and foreparents couldn't do it, but they could? I'm wondering if that was a part.
Yeah, I think so. And some of them were second generation to go to college as well.
Interesting.
Right, yeah.
Yes, I think somebody described technology as pen and piece of paper. You know, that was their technology, because one of the first things that you show was a letter. That was their technology. You know, just think about it. That's the only way they were able to communicate out to the world is to be able to read and write.
Right.
And that is, and that's what they were proud of,
Right.
that they had the ability to read and write. Because, as we said, their generational couldn't do that, probably from slavery, whatever. But they took that little, and we take it for granted now.
With the
When the Intercollegiate Club didn't meet, or they were
Dormant.
Yeah.
dormant. And the reason I thought about that was that in 1917 was when the race riot was
Yeah, 1919.
here in Chicago. And not only that, because they met at the Y on Wabash, that was right there next to State Street. That was just like African American Greenwood, Oklahoma, you know. And I'm just wondering, how did all of that and the Intercollegiate Club kind of mesh together at that time?
That's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure. What I would say is, you know, the way they write about their own history, and then I would have to look into how, I think her name is Woolley, the social worker, and George Arthur, he wasn't a social worker of sorts, but he worked for the Y. He came here from Baltimore, and he was like their advisor, per se. He was there at the beginning and during that time to investigate more what happened. I suppose the war did have an effect on that. And also things dealing with that kind of transition time that happened. But also what I find is interesting is the persistence to keep it going. Because sometimes things like this come and go. But there was something there that, you know, that they saw that needed to continue, right? I think that's a great question. And I think you answered part of it, to tell the truth. I think you did.
And I think that, that might have had something to do with them restarting.
Yeah, exactly.
In 1919.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Dr. Gray, can you share a little bit about the finances and how they sort of fundraised or it offered, maybe were offered support from any sponsors or?
Yeah, well, yeah, with the Y, they were supported through the Y. Yeah, there were and then this is something else I find out. There were other clubs like this. There was one in Indianapolis. They had an intercollegiate club at the Y there, right? And there was another, I believe, in New York City. So they were supported by the Y. I think they did fundraise, and part of this, and these kind of trophies and things are these kind of fundraising activities that the young women did at the time. And through local businesses, in the back of the book, they have all these ads. Overton, everybody, they sold ads just like they did with other kind of yearbooks. And that was, I'm not sure about their dues, but yes, they had to be financial. They were in fraternities and sororities, mostly all of them. So they knew about paying dues to be a member of something. And so they do have in the book those members that are financial and those that weren't, who attended meetings in the last month or this last year, or who stopped attending, who fell off. But they don't want to leave people off. But yeah. Yes.
At one time, I had one of the books.
I know.
But I have so many books, it's been lost in my house or garage. But when I had it, I would go through it a lot. And being a Carrie Temple AME member, I focus a lot on and churches in general. I focus a lot on the churches. And at that time, that particular book dealt a lot with Frederick Jordan being the pastor of Carrie Temple, and how many activities he had for the young people going on at that time so long ago. And many churches still have that, but many churches still don't have all of those activities for young people. And so I thought that was such an advantage. And the other thing that I'm proud of with him is that he did go on to become a bishop in the AME church.
Yeah, and you mentioned those activities. They had a library there. They used to feed the children, like with breakfast, right? Black Panthers, right? They used to feed the children and, having Sunday school.
And those are things that grow in
Gym, yeah. And there was another, they used to meet there too, right? Like I said before. So when they stopped going to the Y, they met at Carrie Temple. And support for us to remember that. Yes.
Two questions. One, were you my student?
Yes, I was.
He's got a good memory. And so I would like to know, what is your opinion, as you have talked about the pride of the Negro Intelligentsia of that era, and what is happening now with an increase of current people of black culture not wanting to be called African American. That they want to drop African and just be American. And I've heard some commentary saying, I can only go back with my parents. I don't know anything about Africa. I don't want to know anything about Africa. I don't want to know that old stuff anymore. What is your opinion of that?
My opinion? Someone has a hand up in the back.
Professor, I would like to say something. I had a conversation with someone regarding that. Their response to me, the term African American is a misnomer. And based on the definition, and then they went on to say that there is no persons in the world named after two continents. So that was their justification for the term African American. And I had a conversation with someone regarding that. So by them saying a misnomer and knowing the definition of misnomer, I could not continue the conversation with them. But I was curious as well why they did not want to use that term. And then I spoke with someone else, and they are saying, well, we're not really black because white isn't, white and black, there's no color in either word. So again, this younger generation has a totally different perspective on terminology and definitions and terms. So that's what I had to say.
So just to clarify, I guess the question I'm asking is what is your opinion when we talk about the black intelligence and being proud of whomever their Negro heritage and wanting to have intellectual groups and to perpetuate positivity, as opposed to what I have heard, current people not wanting to be associated with any type of historical of what my birth certificate says Negro. So what historical Negroes have accomplished, that they only want to celebrate the accomplishment today of them as an individual and discounting what their family may have done.
What I would say to that, Dr. White, is I think that there's always been a variety of opinions, about who we are. When you talk about we, I'm talking about black folks or Negroes or colored folks or African Americans or Africans, what we said in the 18th century, we called ourselves Africans, right? So I think there's a variety of opinions. Even there could have been more conservative thought as well. But something like this was a representation of something different from that, right? And so more than likely, there were other camps that, tried to keep, straight along the path, don't associate me with this and that and the other. And some that, frankly, and, I give them a pass. I say that they weren't elitist. I'm giving them a pass because there were elements of that. Who they married, where they lived. In the book they talk about buying homes and all this kind of stuff, right? But they do talk about helping children and doing things of that nature as well. But so I believe all of that was happening there, and there was a differing opinions. This is not a representation of that, but because it has somebody like Hammurabi Rob there, he brought that kind of consciousness. And Horace Vaughn, it was like alongside with him. And so those that had the power in the group, forced, that kind of thinking. And, they were interested in studying it. If John Tilley wrote a history of 8,000 years of the Negro, they were all over that. Yeah. So yeah.
And just to kind of add on to that, as a contemporarily how people identify, there's a large propaganda misinformation campaign with that's trying to, I see it's very online to try to create a diaspora war within the African diaspora, which I spend probably too much of my time trying to combat. But that is where a lot of that idea with young people come, because young people are very much too much online and getting fed too much propaganda and misinformation. It's not being vetted, and as a instructor, I spend way too much of my time combating misinformation.
Yes, Candace.
I'll be brief. Why do you think that they used Egyptian mythology, even though we're supposed to be taken off the coast of Africa like Togo and all of the countries out there? Egypt is closer, further, deeper into it. So why do you think that they use Egyptian mythology instead of countries that we might have actually came from?
Right. I don't know the source, but I know that it was happening. I wish you know, maybe if I take a little bit more time, I can find out what the source was, because it was widespread.
Right.
It wasn't something specific to them.
Okay.
And so it came out through the art, even in the Harlem Renaissance. Even Ethiopia as well, right? That was another thing. Even in the war, 1919, I looked at some of the draft cards from the Great War, or the First War, where they called themselves Ethiopians. You know, they didn't say I was a Negro or colored. They said Ethiopian, and this is a man speaking of himself for them to write down. So there was this sense of being from Africa, of course, I believe, but that tied to Egypt. I don't know if it was natural, and maybe someone else can help me with this, but
Egypt was one of the first civilizations
right.
that was really truly studied. In the beginning, all you knew was Ethiopia and Egypt. You know?
Right, exactly.
Nubia.
Nubia, yeah.
The people, the bronze people. So it was one of the first cultures that was sincerely studied. And as you graduate in history and come to the present, it started being this enculturation of Egypt, not Egypt, but of Nigeria and Ghana and Togo.
Yeah, and
you know, we didn't even know what a Sierra Leone was until Marcus Garvey came along.
Yeah. And another thing, there was that the tomb of Tutankhamun. I think that was discovered in the early 20th century as well. So all of that coming out, and that made big news. Another thing that they were big on was Amelia Earhart. I thought that was very interesting. Some of the pilots, you know, just whatever they were interested in showed up as well.
We may have time for one more question.
I think, Tammy, did you have a question?
I just had a comment too. When you look at the history of Chicago, and you know, when you think in the context of Harlem, yeah, that was a hotbed too for Black people. That was a hotbed, but Chicago really was too. The founding roots of Chicago, these people in the early times, this was a mover and shaker kind of town. The Black people that were here early on, the Old Settlers Club and all that, these were like not, you know, they might have been in a struggle, but these were like the hipsters and the ritzy-titsy people. You know, Chicago was always, like the song say, that top-lit town. Chicago had a rich history, especially in our community, of movers and shakers being here. Not just, we made it here, now we searching for a job. No, these were movers and shakers in the early period here in Chicago.
Yeah,
they were doing great things, big things.
Thank you, Tammy. And they go ahead, Joe.
Can I make one quick comment when you were talking about everywhere you go, they want to know what high school is. And I'll tell you something else. Politically, I've gone all over, and people here, they know locally, internationally, and national. All the things that are going on politically, and I've never seen anything like it other than Chicago. You can go to other cities, but they will not be politically aware. They are here in Chicago. And I think a lot of it has to do with the information is, you turn on the radio, they're going to talk about what's going on. So people are getting the information already. I'm done.
And Dr. Gray's proof of that we're here still digging up information from the archives that we may not have known or have known little about before. And it's important work. And yes, it is. And we at the BMRC certainly appreciate it, your time. We look forward to what's to come. As you continue your research, you have gathered so much information now. So please keep us posted.